What do children see at pride parades and other pride events? We're going to get into that. Unfortunately, they see a lot more than children should be seeing. So it's June, which is the sacred, secular, liturgical month of Pride. You're going to hate it here. I guess we should start by giving you a bit of background into where these Pride festivals came from to begin with. So they kind of started off as a one-day event, a commemoration of the 1969 Stonewall riots when the New York police raided a bar frequented by the gay community. And then they began a sort of a protest against discrimination and a sort of form of advocacy for all LGBT equality laws. Now, one of the things that I think is important to look at here is I want to emphasize, obviously, I believe in freedom of speech. So activists have the right to assemble publicly. But it is also true, and I think all people of good faith and common sense can agree, that children have the right to be protected from sexually explicit ideologies and sexually explicit displays. And it might seem quaint to say so in our very hypersexualized Western societies, but they have the right to be protected from adult nudity in public places. And so many people have come out in recent years saying, what do you have against Pride? It's a fun-filled family experience. Children are welcome at Pride. And I just want to know, when did we change our mind about the fundamental concept that children should be protected from public adult nudity, and especially should be protected from displays of sexual fetishism and explicit sexual displays that show people in public things that in most cases shouldn't even be done in private? That is precisely what Pride events have become. And LGBT activists and their press allies defend these spectacles without nuance. In fact, for those of you who think you're exaggerating, maybe children go to Pride and some families take kids there, nobody's defending children seeing these things. Well, wait for it, because I wish you were right, but unfortunately you aren't. Let's give a little overview of the kinds of things that children see at Pride to begin with. So at Toronto Pride in Canada, children are regularly exposed to simulated sex acts, adults wearing bondage and other fetish gear, and adult nudity, including, very recently, a middle-aged man hopping past children completely naked except for a Bugs Bunny mask. If you're the kind of person who thinks it's appropriate for small children to see a nude adult man dressed as a cartoon character hopping past children, you're really going to hate the rest of this show. In 2021, Dutch photographer Jan van Breda won a €2,500 prize for snapping, as a local newspaper put it, the most iconic, meaningful, and aesthetic picture from 25 years of Pride in Amsterdam. That photograph, which I won't show you, was of a child, barely earlier than a toddler, playing on a swing while all around him were men in latex bondage gear mingling and preparing for Pride. Again, a toddler near a group of adult men in sexual bondage gear preparing to show up at Pride. This photograph wasn't just sort of an odd photograph snapped on the fringes. It was chosen by a local newspaper as a symbol of 25 years of Pride Amsterdam, and it was called the most iconic, meaningful, and aesthetic. That's a child being exposed to this kind of sexual material. At other European Pride parades, I wrote about this last year for the European Conservative. There was nude participants parading in front of small children in Oslo, some of them in leather puppy outfits. Similar instances were in France, Germany, and almost every other major event in every other European country as well, except for places like Hungary, where pride parades have actually been banned on the premise that the innocence of children is a greater civilizational goal than protecting people's right to expose themselves in public. I could show you photographs and pictures of virtually every one of the things that I'm citing, but I'm not going to, because I don't want to expose you to the sorts of things that are going on, even though they're going on in public. And in most cases, including in Toronto, these things are publicly funded. As I mentioned earlier, many of these events very explicitly target children. So here's a clip, for example, from a New York drag march, and listen very closely to what the marchers are chanting. If you'd like another example of LGBT activists stating this intention loudly and proudly, here's a clip that many of you may have seen because a lot of people commented on it at the time from the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus a couple of years back.
We're coming for your children. We're coming for your children.
And then here's another example of pride content targeted explicitly at children.
It's okay to be gay. We are different in many ways. Doesn't matter if you're a boy, girl, or somewhere in between. We all are part of one big family. Gay means happy. Queer kid stuff. You are enough here at Queer Kid Stuff.
So I think that makes it pretty clear what they're up to. You'll notice that behind that person was a transgender flag, which of course is pushing the message that you may have been born in the wrong body, and we've discussed on previous episodes where that ideology takes us. It's worth noting that even some LGBT people have been very uncomfortable with what children witness at these events. My friend J.G. McCullough has written an entire article detailing why he thinks that these parades have increasingly become just a public display of debauchery. And another article was written in the National Post a couple of years back, also by a gay columnist explaining his discomfort. But I want to quote an article directly from Gay and Lesbian News by somebody called C.J. Liberty. I suspect that's probably a pseudonym. But here is what Liberty wrote. Seeing the pictures of nearly naked blokes in dog masks being led by their masters on chains makes it harder to defend the position that pride isn't all about sex. I would feel the same way about any group or movement in society. Adult sexual activities and events based around that should take place in an indoor adult-only setting. Pride being a mainstream commercial family day does not mix with people displaying adult sexual kinks. Now, he's not kidding, by the way. There's footage of multiple pride parades where you actually have guys in all kinds of weird puppy outfits walking past kids. And here's a photo that we'll put up on the screen just for a minute that shows what that looks like at pride parades. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the mainstream media publicly defends this. They don't just defend the idea that LGBT-themed pride events are good for kids to come to. They don't just defend the idea that kids should also be welcomed into the LGBT movement and into pride events. They explicitly defend nude fetishistic displays in front of children. And I'm going to quote from a couple of different mainstream media articles to show that this isn't just a conclusion I'm reaching by looking at footage of pride or photographs of pride, identifying children in the crowd, pointing at the floats and the displays and the parades and saying, look, the mainstream media is defending this. Because again, some people could justifiably say, well, just because some families take their children to these events doesn't mean that most people approve of children seeing this material. So let's look at an article from the Huffington Post by Brianna Sharp. The title is this: Are Pride Parades Kid-Friendly? Parents say children can handle the kink. Are Pride Parades kid-friendly? Parents say children can handle the kink. And so they're explicitly stating throughout this article that kids should see this. In fact, one activist quoted in the article says, I can't imagine a safer place for families to bring children. Anyone who has been to a parade has likely seen the procession of leather animal costumes, kinky costumes in every hue, and more skin than is normally exposed in public. I'll say, I haven't seen anybody hop down the street of my small town wearing nothing but a Bugs Bunny mask. Although the post and account have since been deleted, the tweet got many people talking. How child appropriate are Pride festivities? And why does this discussion hit a nerve for the LGBT community? Pride has always had kind of an outrageous edge to it, and why should we alter that? It's not the Santa Claus parade, and it never was. It shouldn't be. It's not only important for parents to bring kids, but I've seen thousands of kids at Pride, and I've never seen anyone fuss about what they see there, which I would argue is precisely the problem. And in fact, an educator insists in this Huffington Post article that there's, quote, absolutely no reason not to take our kids to Pride because, quote, it is their right as queer spawn, and because, quote, they may be lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, or two-spirit. Addressing the fact that children are going to see nude adults at these events, here is what this educator in the Huffington Post had to say. Nobody likes nakedness more than children. Nobody likes nakedness more than children. That is not me drawing a conclusion from the imagery that I see at Pride of people engaging in nude or semi-nude sexual displays and then noting that families have brought their children. This is somebody in the Huffington Post, an educator, openly defending children seeing that explicitly and in those terms. So maybe you're saying, well, this is the Huffington Post. Does anybody else defend this? Is anybody else defending children seeing sexual displays put on by adults in public? Well, yes. Let's look at the Washington Post in a column by Lauren Ruello. And here's the title of that article. Yes, kink belongs at Pride, and I want my kids to see it. Let me repeat that one more time. Yes, kink belongs at Pride, and I want my kids to see it. The subtitle is, Children Need to Know That They Can Make Their Own Ways in the World. Now, in the context of guys in leather bondage gear, nude men hopping by, people in weird puppy costumes, the idea that they need to know these kinds of things to make their way in the world when they are children should be deeply upsetting to anybody with basic common sense or anybody who values the innocence of children. So let's take a look at a couple of the different things that she says. I'm going to read to you directly from Ruello's column so you can get a taste of the flavor of what she's advocating. Our family often took the train into Philadelphia, but as we rode across the bridge to attend the city's Pride Parade years ago, my wife's leg bounced with a nervous jitter. She squeezed my hand, worried that she might run into a colleague or be harassed by a stranger. My wife is trans and wasn't out at the time, so she typically only expressed her authenticity in the privacy of our home. That morning, she wore a green skirt and light makeup, brushing all her hair to one side. Even though we'd attended pride marches and protests in previous years, that day was our first celebrating openly as a family. All right, here's the second paragraph. Buckle up. When our children grew tired of marching, we plopped onto a nearby curb. Just as we got settled, our elementary schooler pointed in the direction of oncoming floats, raising an eyebrow at a bare-chested man in dark sunglasses whose black suspenders clipped onto his leather thong. The man paused to be spanked playfully by a partner with a flog. "What are they doing?" my curious kid asked as our toddler cheered them on. The pair was the first of a few dozen kinksters who danced down the street, laughing together as they twirled their whips and batons, some leading companions by leashes. At the time, my children were too young to understand the nuance of the situation, no kidding, but I told them the truth, that these folks were members of our community celebrating who they are and what they do. The kink community has participated in Pride since its inception, risking their jobs and safety to be authentically themselves in public. Still, every year as Pride Month approaches, a debate erupts about whether kink belongs at Pride at all. Those hoping to oust kinksters often cite the presence of children as their top concern. I agree that Pride should be a welcoming space for children and teens, but policing how others show up doesn't protect or uplift young people. Instead, homogenizing self-expression at Pride will do more to harm our children than good. So it will do more harm for her toddler not to see men in leather bondage gear flogging each other on a float than it will for them not to. This is what she's saying. This is not me making it up. In fact, I couldn't make this up and I wouldn't want to. And so there's just a few paragraphs. She concludes by saying that she wants to see her children see kink. She really emphasizes this. And then states that Pride is the perfect place for children to be inculcated into LGBT ideology. Now, I'm hoping that a lot of you watching who may disagree with me on some aspects of the LGBT agenda will read that description and recoil and ask yourself if the idea of children seeing adult sexual kinks acted out in public doesn't make you recoil. Consider the fact that maybe you've been desensitized by a culture that is normalizing children seeing nude adults. Ruello says this: "We don't talk to our children enough about pursuing sex to fulfill carnal needs that delight and captivate us in the moment. Sharing the language of kink culture with young people, she's talking about an elementary schooler and a toddler here, by the way, provides them with valuable information about safe sex practices, such as the importance of establishing boundaries, safe words and signals, affirming the importance of planning and research, and the need to seek and give enthusiastic consent. If you're the kind of person who thinks that children, she's talking about kids here, not just even early teens, kids, should be introduced to safe words, nude people simulating sex acts, and that children should be exposed to the nude genitals of adults in public, or that this is a good discussion opportunity that's good for their sexual development, and that such discussions are never too early, I suspect you're also the sort of person who's enthusiastic about Pride season and enthusiastic about Pride festivals. But forgive me if I'm tired of those of us who object to children being exposed to this kind of thing are accused of being some form of bigot. If it is bigoted to disagree with that description, then you can sign me up. And I hope that you'll be signed up as well, because this is really, really vile stuff. Let's look at yet another article. This one is from the CBC. The CBC, as many of you may know, is the taxpayer-funded state broadcaster of Canada. So if you are a Canadian watching this, you are contributing to this article. You help pay for it. So CBC has a parents section, and a couple of years back, they published an article called 7 Tips for Having a Happy Pride with Your Kids. And the photograph on the article is a toddler holding a balloon marching in the Pride Parade. Now, let's just read number 1. Here's the first tip that the CBC would like Canadian parents to read. Be open-minded. I'm quoting directly here. There will be bodies of all shapes, sizes, and in all states of undress. For parents like Ian Duncan, dad to 3-year-old Carson, this is part of the experience. We're not body shamers, he says. It all feeds into my son's emotional intelligence and development, and it's never too early to think about that. A 3-year-old is going to see the kinds of things that happen at Pride, but it's never too early to think about that, and it feeds into his son's emotional intelligence. Consider the experience, the CBC says, as a great opportunity for some interesting discussion. Explain what you're seeing and be ready for questions. The CBC also emphasizes that you're likely to see, quote, boobs and penises at Pride, but this is also just an opportunity for good discussions. And they quote several other parents who are taking, by the way, all children. Another couple that they quote in this article is taking 2-year-old Liam and 4-month-old Ben. We're talking about children, very small children. And again, that previous description I read of what these kids are seeing is being written by an LGBT activist who's defending it. So that's the Huffington Post, the Washington Post, the CBC. These are big outlets, and they are explicitly defending children being exposed to fetishistic adult sexual activities being performed in public. I would hope that the majority of parents still think it's inappropriate to expose their children to this and do not think it's appropriate for children to see nude adult men dressed as cartoon characters hopping down the street in front of them. It should not take a social conservative or a Christian to see how reprehensible that is. Otherwise, we've completely lost the plot entirely. Now, in Canada, of course, we no longer just have Pride Month. The Canadian federal government several years ago, under the reign of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, declared now Pride season, which is June, July, August, and September, because there's so many family-friendly events to attend and to be hosted across the country that it's really important that we have 4 months, right? Carl Truman often says, how does somebody conquer an empire? And he always says, conquer time and space. Well, they pretty much have the 4 sunniest months now of the calendar, although sunburn is obviously a pretty big risk at these events. Now, I want to end on a slightly more optimistic note, because I do think that most people agree with my basic premise. And I do think that most ordinary people are horrified by the idea of deliberately exposing toddlers and small children to adult sexual acts. I do think that your average person thinks it's pretty horrifying that a parent would say, hey, my 3-year-old should really learn about enthusiastic, consensual fetish play and safe words. Or, well, one was a 3-year-old, the other was an elementary schooler. Surely we can also agree, elementary school, still too young for safe words. But there's some indications that Pride's excesses are beginning to turn people off, thank goodness, finally, and that Pride is losing its cool. Because for years, these events have been fueled by millions of dollars being poured into LGBT coffers by private companies that are really trying to display their progressive bona fides. And nothing quite highlights, to my mind, the merger between big business and the sexual revolution, like big banks like TD, hosting floats and parades, somewhere in between the nude men in leather bondage gear and the cheering transvestites. But as the public pushback to the LGBT movement grows, there is some signs that the corporate ardor for this is cooling. So just one example from earlier this month, Andrew Powell of the Daily Caller gleefully noted that LGBT activists are very alarmed that 12 major NFL teams declined to post anything for Pride Month this past Sunday. And they listed them. This is their naughty list. The Baltimore Ravens, the Cincinnati Bengals, the Cleveland Browns, the Dallas Cowboys, the Indianapolis Colts, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Las Vegas Raiders, the New Orleans Saints, the New York Jets, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Seattle Seahawks, and the Tennessee Titans. So last year, 9 teams declined to post anything for the sacred liturgical month of Pride, and now there's 12 teams, so the number is in fact growing. And as a lifelong non-watcher of professional sports, this is the first time I've heard of most of these people, but I'm glad that they're not hoisting the pride flag every June. And there could be a couple of reasons for this, because over the last couple of years, there have been a few high-profile incidents in which professional sports players very quietly but firmly opted out of celebrating the LGBT agenda. There was a bunch of NHL players who declined to participate in Pride activities. And there was these major cancellation attempts, including from some foam-flecked sportscasters who could not believe that a Christian NHL player, for example, would not want to physically wear on his person the flag of a movement he opposes. The hubris of these people is really staggering when you read these stories, because when you just read the story, the sportscasters will really make it sound like it's so obvious that this hockey player should want to wear a Pride jersey because that shows his support for diversity and tolerance. But the idea that you're so entitled to the culture, to every single aspect of the culture, that you think you have a right to force somebody else who disagrees with your ideology to literally wear on their body your flag, just gives you an idea of how unbelievably arrogant and out of touch these people are. And we really should treat these cancellation attempts with total contempt, because that's exactly what they deserve. Again, this isn't about, well, this team should just be showing support for the LGBT community. No, it's wear our flag on your chest, bigot, or we're going to try and make you lose your job. We should really be treating this stuff with the contempt that it deserves. It could also be that the LGBT movement's embrace of the trans agenda is causing second thoughts in some corporate boardrooms, because we're seeing a lot of developments on that front in multiple countries. We've covered this in the past, so I won't get into the details, but even since our last episode on this, the FBI actually announced that it was going to be investigating doctors who were doing sex change surgeries on minors. And several major corporations have walked away from Pride sponsorship this year, including Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch, for those of you who aren't aware of this beer company, was the creator of Bud Light, or the sailor of Bud Light. And some of you may remember that one of the most successful boycotts in recent memory is when Dylan Mulvaney, a trans-identifying gay man, was featured on one of their promos in his full female getup holding a Bud Light can. And they lost millions of dollars as a result, because it turns out the average guy who drinks Bud Light is super disinterested in having Dylan Mulvaney be the kind of influencer who appeals to him. And so Anheuser-Busch, despite massive pressure to reverse their decision not to fund Pride activities this year, has decided that they don't want to anger their consumer base any further than they already have. And in Canada, there's some indications of a similar trend, which is kind of interesting, because virtually everybody who condemns Pride activities, like the ones that I cited, even, the CBC article advising parents that their kids are going to see, nude adults doing sexual things, but they should take their kids anyways. Despite that, there's been very minimal pushback to the kinds of things that go on at these displays. And in fact, the majority of the pushback in Canada is pressure being put on individual politicians to show up at Pride and to proactively show their support. And people like Premier Doug Ford have attended Pride events. And there's been a Pride flag raising on Parliament Hill every year under Justin Trudeau. Don't know if Prime Minister Mark Carney is going to do so, but I would assume so. But as CTV reported on May 31st, and this was a lovely lead paragraph from the CBC for a change, quote, Pride Toronto has faced another setback, losing two more major corporate sponsors, Google and Home Depot, just days before Pride Month begins, its executive director Kojo Modesti told CP24 on Saturday afternoon. This recent news follows a number of other corporate sponsorship losses or funding reductions that Pride Toronto has experienced in recent months, which leads to a collective shortfall of around $700,000, and organizers are desperately working to shore up support. Now, Modesta called it a, quote, wake-up call. But of course, the wake-up call has nothing to do with the fact that, hey, maybe we shouldn't allow men in leather bondage gear to do their thing in front of kids. No, for him, he emphasized that this shift is probably due to the Trump administration's stances on LGBT issues, and that some sponsors, quote, that they believed were committed allies to our community have shown themselves to be, at least in part, swayed by external political pressures. This is obviously a joke because all of the external political pressures in Canada would indicate that opposing Trump is a great strategy. In fact, Mark Carney is basically prime minister right now because he made running against Trump his entire campaign platform. So whatever the reason for Home Depot and Google's withdrawal, it really has nothing to do with Trump. But what's really interesting is that they only found out about Google's withdrawal on May the 1st and Home Depot's decision last Wednesday, which means these companies did pull their support very, very recently. And then Modesta says this, and consider his quote in the context of those articles we just read to you from parents and LGBT activists in mainstream media outlets. More than anything, this moment underscores the importance of values-based leadership. Pride has never been easy or convenient. It is about visibility, equity, and justice, even when it's politically unpopular. It should be politically unpopular to make the adult nude people invisible to kids. This should not be hard. We remain committed to those principles. Good to know. And we're calling on partners new and long-standing to show that their support is not conditional. I think support should be conditional on whether or not you're exposing children to sexual practices, but that's just me. Maybe you disagree. So obviously this has nothing to do with Trump, but this narrative allows the LGBT activists to kind of avoid any real soul searching about the kinds of displays they put on Canadian streets and indeed on Western streets right around the world. In the meantime, you'll be happy to know, especially if you're a Canadian taxpayer, the government is stepping up to provide the festival with the taxpayer dollars to continue their activities. And again, Modesta's comments has gotten it precisely wrong. It has in fact been easy and convenient for people to support Pride. That's why basically every major corporation has wrapped themselves in the Pride flag every single June for years because there was no financial cost to doing so, and in their mind, a significant financial benefit for doing so. And the fact that they're no longer pouring money into LGBT coffers at the same rates, it's an interesting thing. We don't know exactly why yet. There's no reason that stands out in all the articles I read about this as to why they're doing it. But the reasons that have been cited are very clearly not what's going on. So perhaps things are changing. Time will tell. For those of you who started to watch this episode and thought, well, I think that adults should be able to do what they want to do. I agree that activists should be able to gather in public and express their political worldviews. Freedom of speech is a fundamental bedrock view. As somebody who works in the pro-life movement, we need freedom of speech to be able to advocate for our own values and principles in the public square. But can we all agree that outside of our commitment to freedom of speech, that some things step outside the boundaries of freedom of speech, and that exposing children to explicit sex acts in public, exposing children to adults in fetishistic sexual gear, exposing children to naked men dressed as cartoon figures hopping down the street, that is outside the boundaries of freedom of speech, that this should be illegal, that the innocence of children should be protected, and indeed the innocence of children should be prioritized. If you agree with me on that, maybe we have more common ground than you might think. Even if we disagree on other aspects of LGBT ideology, maybe you could consider joining a coalition of the sane and say, no, not appropriate for children to be exposed to sex acts in public, and we certainly shouldn't be funding a festival where that's not only deliberately occurring, but being defended in major mainstream media outlets, including Canada State Broadcaster, which you, the Canadian public, fund with your taxpayer dollars. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Bridgehead Briefing. Please do drop a comment if you want to join the discussion. You can push back if you disagreed with any of my points, and we'll respond to those. If you found this content helpful, please do subscribe to the channel. That helps us out a lot, or like the video and share it around. You can also find this podcast wherever you get your podcast content. Thanks for listening.